Well, first of all, thank you all for coming. I'm really excited with the panelists that we have today. I know Oren was kind of talking about the progression that we've seen over the course of time with our Business of APIs conference. And one of the most interesting things I see now is that really the APIs are powering companies to be able to scale and grow at a really effective rate and really allowing companies to be global and to expand. And we've picked what we call kind of the hottest companies in the UK right now. I think that's fair to say. Yeah? I mean, come on, you got to brag a little bit.
Definitely.
So with that, I have Chris Morton, co-founder and CEO of Lyst. I have Andy Young, the UK country lead for Stripe. And James Moore, co-founder and CEO of Central Index. So with that, I know very much what you guys all do, but just for those in the audience that might not, if you could just give a quick description of your companies, that would be awesome. I'm staring at you to start.
That's good. Can you hear me? Yeah. So Lyst is the largest fashion marketplace in the world in terms of what we do. We aggregate the inventories of all the biggest department stores, fashion boutiques and brands from US, Europe, Australia, with APIs or without APIs, really whatever we have to offer, have to work with. And then we try to create personalized shopping experiences for each of our consumers around the world.
Hey everybody, my name's Andy. So Stripe, we're the easiest way to take credit and debit card payments on your website or in mobile applications. Founded about 3 years ago, launched a couple of years ago in the US. It's now really exciting for us as we expand internationally with the UK being our first European market. Founded based on the premise that payments hadn't really changed in the last 10 plus years online, whilst originally payments were kind of like grafted onto the internet in the early days when banks sort of, the internet came along and people looked at the payment industry and thought, okay, well, typically we do payments traditionally, let's just keep doing it as we're doing it, but with a little bit of internet thrown in. And when you compare to things like cloud and hosting and the speed at which that was developing and just making other parts of doing business a hell of a lot easier, as every year went by, it seemed that payments were really static. So that was the basis behind founding Stripe. Today we process billions of dollars per year for companies of all sizes, from startups right through to blue chip companies.
Hello everyone, can you hear me okay? I'm James Moore. So I've been in local search since 1997. I launched a business directory here in the UK. I don't think APIs existed back then properly, but we were trying to solve the problem of helping small businesses to get onto the internet with our own local directory. Over time, the business model evolved, and we began to work with large publishers, all of whom were trying to get into local search. So we developed an API-based product and launched this under the brand centralindex.com. We now power about 600 local and national newspapers here in the UK. We've just gone live in Ireland. We've just put 20 million records live in the States, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. What we're trying to do is create the world's best, most accurate, up-to-date central index of local information. All of you may have recognized the recent debacle with a certain mapping product that was launched where a lot of the data was wrong. This is a major problem in local search and mobile, that real hyperlocal data isn't accurate. So our vision is to try to aggregate all of the sources of local information, rich data, make them available over an API, and then help business owners to take control over their own data, or index card as we call it, so that they can make sure that information is correct, and then syndicate that out to various endpoints. So it's very exciting, we're growing very fast, and happy to discuss this with any of you later on. Thank you.
Great. And I think it's fair to say that in terms of the industries that you've all entered, is that you're kind of disrupting, in a sense, well-established companies. So the Yellow Pages, Amazon, PayPal's. What do you think has been the main drivers that you've been able to be so successful in that space? Consumer behavior, technology changes?
Well, I don't think we're disrupting Amazon, if that was referring to us.
Retail. I was trying to do a broad retail.
Well, the interesting thing is that, Amazon is probably the company that I admire the most, and I would never want to go up against them in a vertical that they would compete against us. And Amazon, despite trying very hard, have never been able to get into fashion. It's quite a very strange brand-driven vertical, which is very different to the rational commerce of books and TVs and such. So really, if you want to buy a book or a TV or a plane ticket, you kind of know where you're going to go online. But if you want to buy a sweater, there isn't that one place. You have to go to all these tens of thousands of stores. So we're kind of disrupting that hyper-fragmented, slightly technophobic vertical. Most of the partners we work with think API is an avant-garde French fashion label. So these are sort of different challenges that we have.
For us at Stripe, I think it's pretty interesting that typically when you have a breakout company, timing is very important in that something changed, maybe the market dynamics changed, or technology moved forward to such that a company was for the first time able to take advantage of something and really break out. With Stripe, with payments, as I mentioned before, I think the really interesting thing was that payments had kind of remained static on the internet for such a long time. And so, when the founders, John and Patrick, who started Stripe, Irish guys, they said they didn't feel that there was any sort of particular insight or timing in terms of starting Stripe. It was more like, why is it so surprising that no one has done this already, and that the state of payments and just the difficulties involved with just getting set up to take payments online as a new business, having to deal with banks and merchant accounts and gateways and on the API side, ultimately what Stripe is, we are an API for accepting payments. The API is our core products, and the environment was such that integrating APIs and building payment integrations was just a really nasty experience. As I said, APIs and services for hosting, for or outsourcing, all these non-core parts of your business had been moving forward so fast in terms of all other areas. As any business, you want to focus what is core for your business. What your nature of business is, and on all these sort of underlying things that you just have to do in order to operate, but they're not core. You should be able to outsource them or use off-the-shelf products. And that was just in a really bad state for payments. And so the interesting thing I think that we've done with Stripe is just being the first people to really care that much to look into the payment space from the perspectives of the APIs, from the perspective of the developers, and just say it is hard to do payments and it shouldn't be.
Yeah, I can testify for that. That my guys were just putting together an app with one of our developer partners, and we were looking for different payment gateways, and the Stripe one stands out just because of the simplicity of it. It's absolutely vital to be able to understand that you're developing for programmers. But to answer your question, we're in an interesting place. Some of the YP companies have done incredibly well. The Canadian Yellow Pages is particularly one worth mentioning, and I believe that they're a client for you guys, doing some really innovative stuff with APIs. But it's a massive, if I can say the expression, ballsy move to be prepared to move and make your data available over an API when you've been living in a legacy world where you're very protective over it, where you're very protective over your brand. And I think what gives us the edge over these competitors in other territories is the fact that we are completely agnostic about the brand. We're not trying to prove anything on a brand level. All we're trying to do is to make available the best quality data set for anyone to contribute to and anyone to make use of. And by using this sort of inclusive approach and making the best possible APIs to allow that to happen, we believe that we can facilitate the market. I mean, so much so that we now supply to many of those companies who would otherwise be seen as competitors.
So when you say making the best possible APIs, I know within the audience everyone's in various stages. What does that mean? We hear a lot, treat your APIs as product. That's kind of like the buzz phrase. It was, eat your own dog food. Now it's APIs as products. I can't wait to see what the one is next year as well. I'm sure we'll probably be the ones that make up the term. But what does that kind of mean for you when you think about that?
Well, I think that is basically, we did use the expression eat your own dog food when we were developing it. One of the key principles when we were writing the API was, and I remember one of our developers was very excited about some announcement that was circulated by Jeff Bezos of Amazon, who said, from now on, any internal development, everyone has to liaise over APIs. And everyone was like, oh my God, he's completely lost it. But as a result of this, you've got the Amazon Web Services platforms, and we all take our hat off to that approach. So the approach that we use for API as a product is exactly that. Everything we build, and we build a number of applications to demonstrate the power of the API. So we don't just leave the API and say, hey, come and build. We have to prove how you can do it. But everything we've built from an application admin side and a UI side is all built on our own protocols. So there's nothing that we do that our API partners can't do. And that concept of being able to say, hey, these are all the tools, this is the documentation, here are the libraries for all of the various types of languages, that is very important. And I think that that's the way you're thinking of the API as a product. You're thinking of the developer first, and as developers developing for developers, frankly, our guys have a lot of fun doing it because they really do recognize that need.
I think when you think of a product, traditionally you think of something tangible, something you can touch, something you can hold, something that you interact with, have an experience with. And so the trap is when you're dealing with an API to be thinking about what it enables, whether it's enabling access to data, whether it's enabling another function to happen. And skip over the bit where it's what it is actually like to interact with that API. So, as a developer, as a product manager, designer, trying to think, okay, so this API is available to me. How can I interact with it? How can I understand it by playing with it? How can I, build new things on top of it? And so thinking about the experience of building on top of an API comes down to the approaches that you would take with good product design in general, simplicity, cutting out extraneous features, just good planning, good use of naming, an API that's easy to explore, rather than having to read reams of documentation, which would form just barriers to entry. An API you can just start using, as a technical person and easily find your way around, and then also just an API that's just pleasant, easy, and quick to work with. And so this is what we had with Stripe. Is look, when Stripe was founded, looking at the market, that typically the existing payment APIs were had been built up over many years with a lot of components added along the way, with the result that they were very complex. Documentation was hard. It was difficult to find out even just which APIs to use, let alone how to use them. And so, that's probably the biggest thing that we focus on is, the API is our product, and that just means putting a lot of thought into it.
Can I ask how many lines of code is it?
It's secret sauce.
Simple is good.
And I know, you're still kind of in the process of being more of a consumer of APIs. What are you seeing out there in terms of having that delightful experience when you're using them?
It's pretty varied. So some of our partners get it and have wonderful APIs, but they're few and far between. Some people say they have this awesome real-time API, and really that means that we can just call their static data feed in real time, which is utterly useless. But it's a step along the way. And then many of our partners are on like Magento, Demandware, Shopify, and these platforms have APIs of varying degrees of quality, but they're all being updated pretty quickly. So I think everyone gets that APIs are going to become increasingly important. People are developing, the retailers are developing APIs internally for, as mobile continues to eat the web, how is the mobile app going to communicate with your website? You need an inventory API, you need a transaction or order API. And now that they've got these things, they're kind of figuring out, well, hey, if I just externalize this, then I can start powering a whole bunch of other innovative stuff. So it is getting there slowly but surely, and we're actually, in some ways, in the business of actually building APIs for our bigger partners who aren't there yet, so that we can then access their data in the best way. So, I think in maybe 5 years, there will be a proliferation of APIs in the fashion retail industry, but it's going to take a while.
We'll tell our sales team to get on that. No, I definitely think in terms of, just on that, we are seeing kind of an increase in retailers in that space, but it's very internal in that perspective. So with that too, and I know an interesting question is how you balance basically your own internal development with kind of your public-facing or your customer-facing APIs in the sense. So is there anything that you're doing internally to kind of have that balance? Obviously if your API is a product, that kind of is your product roadmap. Yeah. But there is still a lot of internal development versus external, and how do you kind of balance that?
Well, for us, we have an API which we use ourselves every moment of every day. So it comes back to your point about eating your own dog food. Right now, that API is only internal for us, and who knows what's going to happen in the future. So it's kind of too early for us to say.
Yeah, certainly at Stripe, we've kept it simple, and I think it's fair to say that's one of the things that have helped us really focus and be successful at what we do. I think the success for this in general relies upon I think what maybe is maybe the issue, if you like, for maybe many people in the audience thinking about APIs and thinking about APIs from different perspectives is to really think about, if you're trying to come up with an API for a particular purpose, so how can you go about that in a way that means you'll have maximum success? And a key factor here is ensuring that the API is not a standalone project. And as Chris was saying, to the extent that an API can be done harmoniously with internal development, so you're actually building an API that you use to build your own internal services, but yet then have the option of if you build that appropriately, exposing that publicly. I think that by aligning the incentives there and basically going about the appropriate level of technical architecture and having the sort of commitments to the API strategy at the high level and all the way up the chain basically, that's going to ensure sort of maximum success when thinking about building an API, because the risk is that you have like an API project that has certain stakeholders that sort of ends up at the risk of being sort of sidelines. Something we're certainly very fortunate to be able to avoid easily.
I think it's a really good question, because we work with a lot of major publishers, a lot of companies and enterprise corporates who have a huge infrastructure on ITC that they have to maintain. And to talk to them about, hey, can you give me your branches over an API? They're like, yeah, right, I might be able to email you a CSV file, and I don't know, I'll get that from PR or the ops department. It's something which, to say to them, hey, just build an API and then start running everything on that is not an easy ask. So the first piece of advice I would give is to say, don't be afraid of partnering with experts. When we wanted to launch the API, we knew that we could, are we going to build our own developer portal? Are we going to do all the keys? Are we going to do all that? That could have taken us literally 6 months or a year and have a whole area of our lives dedicated to doing something which had already been perfected by people who are already doing that piece. So I think the key thing is understand why you want an API. If your vision is to be running your business on an API in the future, but you're still in a situation where it's very difficult to do, don't be afraid to do the baby steps, partnering, proof of concepts, find the people who are best of breed in certain areas. And then gradually, if it becomes a success, then you can bring these things in-house. Any partner in this world, and the whole point about APIs and data exchanges, at any point, contractually or commercially, you can shift the data from one place to another or whatever it is. So I think the businesses that will succeed in migrating to APIs are those who have the vision to understand the opportunity and have the confidence and internal sort of trust to be able to say, let's partner with someone on this, let's see if it works, and then we can take it from there.
Yeah, I love that actually. So I think we do see quite a few companies that kind of do that siloed approach where it's a side project and there's a few stakeholders and it kind of gets bounced around a little bit, and it's also very much, if we open an API, they will come. And I think, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, it's also worth mentioning, if you say to a head of technology, and there are probably a few in the room, and say, right, I want this whole thing to be done on an API, they could go away and come back to you with a 10-year business case, and everything else you ask for in the future to develop the business will be put on hold in order to deliver this thing which you asked for. So it's a very difficult thing to do, to talk about that migration. It's an easy thing to turn into a white elephant.
Yeah, absolutely.
You spoke a little bit about having the sort of confidence to share your data, and because this is a startup panel, it kind of reminded me of the different attitudes that young companies have in terms of sharing what they're building. And there's sort of this sort of West Coast Bay Area attitude of like, I'm building something, I want everyone to know about it because I'm going to learn as much, and the appreciation of this sort of baby photo syndrome where you obviously think your idea is the cutest, and you're kind of like paranoid. I feel like in Europe, and it's getting better, there's a bit more paranoia that if you share an idea that they're going to love it as much as you, and they're going to drop everything they're doing and be like, oh my god, it's amazing, I'm going to go and quit my job and build this. And I wonder if there's a parallel with that in the API.
Well, I think absolutely. One of the key issues is that data, especially up in the last 50 years, let's say, has been held as a huge asset. It's the one thing on the balance sheet, it's the one thing that people can hold on to as the asset, and people protect it. The problem is, in the open data world, the data is getting better if you free it. And so everyone's sitting there, a lot of people are desperately trying to protect what they have while it degrades. And I think one of the opportunities with an open approach to data, to sharing, I mean, you're aggregating fashion content, there's a lot of rich stuff that can be put onto that. But if I sit here, classic example, if one's trying to help somebody to find where's the best place I can buy a particular brand, a lot of brands will say, well, I'm not giving you my database of local distributors because my competitors will find it. You're like, well, okay, but also the people who want to buy your product will find it. So what are you going to do? Are you going to hide the fact that you have a local distributor on this high street to your 5 main competitors, or tell the millions of people who want to buy your product where to buy the product? So it's that mind shift, which I think is enabled by APIs and is very, very exciting.
Yeah, very interesting. Are you seeing that as well? Well, just in terms, sorry, I was pointing it because, yeah.
Sorry.
Because I know in terms of one of the interesting things is that, for all of these businesses is looking at it from a global perspective. So you do a lot of work on the West Coast and the UK as well. So, and there definitely is, coming from San Francisco, that open mentality of let's share everything,
Yeah.
It's completely in stealth mode, but let me tell you the exact thing that we're doing, and let me show you everything. Whereas here it seems to be a little bit more reserved.
Yeah, it definitely is, but it is getting better. I mean, there is, I think the startup culture from the Bay Area is infiltrating here, bit by bit. Mm-hmm. And I think in terms of the openness, the market dynamics are pretty important. So e-commerce is the fastest growing area. Fashion is one of the fastest growing areas within e-commerce. However, the number of players who are entering the space is exceeding the size of how quickly that pie is growing. And so there's a lot of market dynamics pushing the retailers to grow with the industry, and actually opening up that data and using platforms like Lyst to help drive tens of millions of sales is important. I guess that's kind of why you work with many of these retailers as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, most definitely. And what about with Stripe? I think it's interesting is you're also dealing with, customers and developers in the 2 different areas. Have you seen a difference in the interactions or the day-to-day?
Yeah, sure. Even with my background, my context, my background before I was working on Stripe was I co-founded a couple of tech startups here based in London. It's very much I would say, it's easy to get hung up, and I kind of get a bit sick of every panel for 10 years in London has been obsessed with this Bay Area versus Europe thing. But I think there's definitely things that over here we can learn from, and willingness to play around is maybe one of them. It's certainly something that, as I said, Stripe, we've been operating for a couple of years now, scaled up to billions of dollars in transaction volume per year at this stage, and we don't even have a dedicated outbound sales team yet within the company. We've been fortunate in, our route to market in the early days was very much going out there, working with other startups initially, and sitting down with them, helping you, saying, hey, what are your payments challenges? Can we help you actually build your own integration on top of our API? And then scaling up from there, and then as reputation grows, and we were able to scale up that way. But still, I think there's this bias towards on the West Coast, there's much more readiness to start reaching out and poking with something and playing around with it and just seeing what's possible. Whereas maybe over here, there's more of a focus on high level concerns and ideas and this sort of thing. And ultimately, what an API is an interface for developers to be able to build things. And so I think that's very much worth bearing in mind that in any context where an API is being considered. It's all about going to market through developers, essentially. If you're not going to market through developers, then the API really matters far less. So having that coherent in terms of the strategy, I think makes all the difference.
You look like you had something.
I think it's a very good point, and I think the interesting thing about you're taking the API, it's an access point for any customer. And that market can be internal or external. One can evolve an internal operation. Again, referring to large retail groups, for example. The reason I'm bringing this up is because we're going through a lot of getting guys to give us their local data. In this instance of who's got the latest branch list? Is it the PR department? Is it the ops department? Is it the guy who runs sales? And they all have their different Excel spreadsheets, which are all slightly out of date or in different sync. And so a key opportunity there is if you're developing an API, you've got 3 internal customers, all of whom can contribute to that data and use that data, and then in so doing that, you can also actually have a store finder that's up to date on your website or things like this. So suddenly, by freeing the data, you are opening a huge range of opportunities to market on a single local level or to interact internally, operationally, and things like that. So the API is for customers, both internal and external.
Mm-hmm. Give me that too. What's the most interesting thing you've seen built on your APIs? And I know yours is internal right now, so it can be the most interesting thing you've built, but kind of in the outside perspective as well.
Well, you know, as a payments API, we're really fortunate that we see a whole host of exciting businesses. You know, you've got your standard e-commerce companies. Then you've got, you know, all sorts of platforms, you know, that allow other people to take payments. You know, the marketplace platforms, shopping platforms such as Shopify, invoicing platforms targeting SMEs like Xero, Free Agent. But then you get like a whole host of more interesting businesses. You know, with Stripe, I think here in the UK, we've seen everything from like a marketplace where you can, you know, dog owners can get matched up with dog lovers to, you know, look after your dog for the weekend, borrow my doggy. That's that one. Better experience all round than the nice. Kennel. Thread.com is like an online, you know, personal shopping service. You know, kit you out with, you know, good fashions. You know, all sorts of things. And then you get like a whole new wave of what's really interesting for us is more interesting business models. And so I think for 2013, we had this buzzword, if you like, in the tech industry of like collaborative consumption. But we saw that in a very tangible way in terms of companies like Lyst and Sidecar, the ride-sharing services that were, you know, compared to a traditional taxi service, would enable anyone to be able to be a provider, you know, make available their car to give rides, and on the other side, connect them with this whole, you know, marketplace of you know, people wanting a lift for demand. And so I guess from our perspective, one of the most fun, most challenging things, most key things for us to do is to really keep on the pulse with these new business models, because one of the biggest things we do with Stripe is beyond the you know, the basic sort of, you know, facilitate transactions, actually look to see what new products we can provide that help support these new business models. One example is our Stripe Connect products we released, I think, over a year ago now, that actually helps people build marketplaces and the specific functions you need from marketplace. Again, sort of trying to push this forward in terms of making it easier for people to you know, build out what's interesting about their business idea without having to rebuild all this sort of common infrastructure.
So I think the most popular thing that we built with our API is a small feature called the sale alert feature. So any item you like will let you know the instant it goes on sale anywhere in the world that will ship to you. Probably the thing that I find the most interesting is when you can dive into the data of what's trending where. So looking at sort of little microcosms that see what fashion is trending in Shoreditch versus in Chelsea versus in the Bay Area, and amazing things come up there. And I think the high-level question that we think about what it could be doing in the future is, I think we have this belief that commerce is going to be distributed around the web, and that wherever that inspiration strikes you of like, wow, I love this, I must have this, you should be able to transact then and there. As opposed to right now, if that happens, if you're reading a magazine or on a social site, you have to go through a bunch of clicks, you might have to go through Google, you might see a bunch of fake items, it's all super painful. And I think that will be sort of a macro movement we'll see online in the next few years about saying commerce will be distributed to that point of inspiration.
Yeah, and I think that resonates hugely with this whole the whole API approach. And I remember when we had our initial call prior to this, we were talking about the fact things like making a fashion decision and wanting to buy there and then. We're doing a very interesting thing with data layering now. So we're now reaching out to partners who've got rich data, whether it be events or reviews or whatever it is, carrying their branding, but being able to overlay it onto the geocoded entity. And so things like if you've got an API where one can purchase a particular piece of clothing, one can overlay that on the shop wherever it's seen, whether it's on a newspaper website or on a little app that someone's built. So in terms of things that people are doing today, we've got some pretty cool stuff. And it's interesting to see that convergence of mobile and social that was being talked about earlier. We're doing a limited release to public developers. A lot of our work's been focused on doing the newspaper releases, but we've had a guy just recently doing a challenger to Groupon, which is a sort of reverse offers product here in London called London Lifestyle Rewards. It's quite smart because the business gets to keep all of the money, and they built that entirely on our platform. We've got quite a cool thing which is called the working name is Project Lash, but I think we'll probably change it, which is you're in three different. You and your mates want to meet up for a drink, and it's a mashup between our data and this great API called iGeolize, which tracks time to travel using various things.
a lash up.
It's a lash up, exactly. So you put in your 5 points, you say, find us the nearest bar that's open now with an offer, and it will give you, within 15 minutes or something, it will give you the place which is quickest to get to from where you all are. And it's quite a smart little application. So this marriage of local gives us a whole vista. I mean, there's a guy talking about dog-friendly pubs at the moment, which might tie in with what you're doing. You can really do anything. When you've got a proper live map of what's there with rich data on it, then the world is your oyster, as they say.
So already you guys have saved me money, being able to get me tipsy, rent a dog, and get a ride home. That's perfect. I mean, my life is already better just from today, so it's great. No, I think that's fantastic. Just seeing, I think, one of the most powerful things when we look at companies that are exposing their APIs is what other people are building off of them. It's always exciting to see, they have so much innovation, and it's just every day there's something new, and it can be completely out of the ordinary, or it could just be something you're like, wow, why didn't I think of that? So it's always really interesting. So as being kind of all, co-founders, and from your past experience too, for the folks that are in the room, what's kind of the biggest piece of advice that you wish someone had told you before you kind of began your initial kind of journey as entrepreneurs? Totally put you on the spot with this one.
Well, I think something that Andy touched on earlier, this idea of customer development, and once you have an idea, trying to validate that before you write 1 or 500 million lines of code is probably a pretty good idea. So you can get out, get some paper prototypes, spend some time in the pub, see what resonates, what doesn't resonate, and typically the first idea that you love that you're convinced is going to be world changing, the first wave of feedback will crush that, and there'll be a little glimmer of something new, or this little feature you didn't think was very important in your paper prototype suddenly becomes the foundation of this new business. And so I think that attitude to building a business at sort of very streamlined way, I think would be my biggest piece of advice.
I think one of the best pieces of advice I ever received was from a board member of my previous startup, Mike Volpe at Index Ventures. Credit to him when he was saying at one point he sat back and said, "Look, you got a great team. They're really smart. They're working really hard. You're putting in a lot of effort, but it seems that you're pushing uphill. The market, the environment isn't necessarily working with you. You sort of imagine if you had the same team working, just as hard, but you'd chosen a challenge or chosen a market, or choose your battles where you can play in the fast-flowing water, as it were. And it's just a lot easier to operate in that environment. And I think the takeaway there is in terms of actually. It's worth persevering with what you're trying to do, but at the same time, keep in mind looking for, playing with an idea that actually once you're, it's basically it's the difference between once you're onto something versus once you're trying things that the market isn't really receptive to, and it makes all the difference. And suddenly your problems are, too many people are calling you as opposed to, trying to get FaceTime with people, etc., etc. So that was, I think, was one of the biggest takeaways.
Great.
Yeah, I think I've got two sort of possibly conflicting, but they kind of work for me. One is never give up. Never give up. No matter, I mean, if you think you're onto something and you've got enough feedback to show that it's real, which is fundamental, you'll have 99 people out of 100 who tell you it's complete rubbish, it'll never work. So never give up on that. But the other thing, to coin the poem, if you can dream but not make dreams your master, and I think that's the key thing, is it's very exciting to have a vision. If that vision becomes bigger than reality, it starts to cost money. If it starts to cost money and it's not working, be prepared to change, be flexible, be adaptable. So it's that mix between keeping the vision alive but listening to reality, listening to the actual market and feedback.
That's great advice. And I think it's actually interesting. So the number one piece of advice in our New York and San Francisco panel was always raise more money than you need. I don't know what that says. I'm just saying that was the trend then.
It's interesting because here in London, because it's harder to raise money, we say try and avoid raising money and make your business work to begin with, and then you can...
Yeah. Uh-oh. That sounds like a battle that could happen. I'm going to stay away from that question. And then we just have a little bit more time. One of the things that I always find interesting is, especially when kind of smaller companies, when you're looking at the enterprise companies out there that are, doing innovative things, are there any companies that you kind of admire right now? I know you mentioned Amazon earlier, but companies that you think are truly being innovative, that are truly taking advantage of new technologies, and really even companies that you might not normally have thought of as innovative.
I think you do have to take your hat off to Facebook for the API move that they made. It was mentioned earlier, the huge value, and I think that was, again, a pretty impressive move at the time when everyone was seeing them as a destination point. That API, I think, radically changed their business. The other side, you'd have to say the same. In the API world, it has to be Amazon, in my view, but...
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking of Twitter, but I think it's for a similar reason. If you look at the things that really take you to be sort of that extra step in innovation, it's saying everyone thought they were in one business, but then it turned out they were in like a whole other business. And so this is very much related to the point about not being afraid of opening up the API and having other people compete with you on top of the API. What's really interesting is how by opening up, like as Twitter did, as Facebook did, as Amazon have with their e-commerce platforms, they can then make their core business like the next level above that platform for a whole set of business which is just multiple times bigger than it otherwise could be. I think that's it requires a lot of guts, it requires a lot of capital, it requires being in the right place, the right time, with the right mindset, the right buy-in. But I think that it's very easy to trot out the same list of companies that people look up to. But I think what's interesting is sort of specifics about what they're doing that's really interesting, and that for me is something that I think about a lot.
Well, I think it's interesting too is that both Twitter and Facebook have been under quite a bit of attack with their APIs and kind of their terms of service and how they treat them and their documentation, and yet we still view them as very innovative just based on kind of what they're doing and what they're releasing. So do you think that there is some kind of tipping point in terms of the negative reaction of developers versus the innovation they're creating?
Definitely. I mean, in the end, if they're making available technology, everyone's going to complain about the technology, what it doesn't do, but if they're the only people doing what it does do, then you've got to take your hat off to it.
I think the point back to, which is useful as a takeaway for anyone providing an API, is to think in terms not of what we're creating, but what we're enabling other people to create, and be very reactive to that and not necessarily prescriptive. A lot of what we do at Stripe is learning from what we can from our users and what they're trying to do. And ultimately, it's some inspiration for a lot of products we create with the API is, we see people doing things that we didn't expect or we didn't imagine or we didn't think were that important, and realize that they're doing something where there's a whole lot of something really interesting there, like a new business model, for example, or a new way of flows of funds, etc., etc. But then maybe there's a lot of heavy lifting that can be done that we can do centrally and make that more accessible to other businesses.
I think to your point about the criticism, the APIs that are being released, they're not going to float everyone's boat, but I think, and critics are always going to have their voice, but I think if you're providing something useful for other people, and eventually enough people are building their business on top of your business, I mean, that's pretty powerful.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's truly a lot of times too, and I'd be curious to get your input. We hear the words platform and API as interchangeable. And I have some kind of, feelings on that. What are your thoughts in terms of the differences?
I mean, so, I think an API is something really specific, in terms of meaning, in terms of like its the ability, it's a set of standards that allow developers to build things that can exchange data and perform actions with remote systems provided by, typically third parties. Something really, really specific, but then I think this is the interesting thing that maybe, for all of us to think about is it's really easy to get bogged down in the specifics of just what it looks like. But if you start thinking about the platform side of things, it's more about why are we doing this? What are we trying to make possible? So for me, it's easy to get caught up in the buzzwords, but a platform is very much, okay, we're going to create something that will enable a whole bunch of other things to happen. And suddenly it shifts the focus to like, what are these other things and who wants to do them and what are the incentives involved and, all that sort of thing. Because, the alignment of incentives and understanding like what the ultimate goal is, I think these are all, super relevant points.
I guess it comes down to the same principle we have at approach. It doesn't really matter what they call it, you know. If it works, it's an interface. So in any business development meeting or whatever, you might have a conversation with someone who doesn't know what the hell an API is. You can wave your hands and say platform, system, access our data, whatever. It doesn't matter. You can then get into the semantics with developers about which bit is a platform, which bit is an API. Fundamentally, I think as long as it's being used, it doesn't matter what they call it.
Interesting.
I mean, I don't really have much to add. I always think of API as the cable and a platform as the machine. But yeah, the words get interchanged.
Yeah, no, we definitely see them interchange. I mean, I think, you know, one of the definitions I see is kind of why your comment spurred it was that when you're actually seeing people building businesses off of your APIs and you're creating an additional ecosystem, that's really when you become kind of a platform in a sense. But it's one of my favorite topics because everyone kind of has a different view on it, but they're completely used interchangeably all the time. And I'm sure everyone here kind of has their own thoughts on it as well. So I think with that, thank you guys so much for being on the panel.
Thanks very much. Thank you.